GSB. I'm the president of the Stanford GSB Asian Alumni Chapter, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our leadership webinar tonight. I hope everyone is safe and well, despite being surrounded by a lot of negative news lately. Most of us, myself included, are working from home, but one silver lining with this lockdown is that we have been able to make connections online with virtual events. And because they are virtual and not in person, it allows us to reach speakers and audiences from around the world versus from just a single location. Virtual events can help us to build the Asian alumni community globally, even during these pandemic times. As a result, we're able to get 3 very accomplished Asian alumni to join in tonight and share their perspectives from Singapore, Hong Kong, and the US. Tonight's webinar is sponsored by the GSB Asian Alumni Chapter in collaboration with SAPAAC, the Stanford Asian Pacific American Alumni Club. Both alumni organizations have programs and events for members that may interest you. If you're a GSB grad, whether you're an MBA, PhD, MSX, Sloan, or the Stanford Executive Program, we welcome you to join and get involved with the Asian Alumni Chapter. All Stanford grads, regardless of degrees earned, are welcome to join SAPAAC. I've listed on the slide some contact information, so please look us up if you have questions about how to engage with us. Hopefully by now, Zoom is familiar to everyone here. Here's a list of few Zoom tips to make this session effective and engaging for you. The key point is to use the chat function if you want to communicate with other attendees, and to use the Q&A box if you wish to pose a question to the panel. So that they can remain engaged in the dialogue, the panelists will not be responding to direct chats. We're also going to be running a couple of polls during this session, so please input your responses when the polls appear on your screen. And I want to remind everybody again, this webinar is being recorded. Just to set the table, the purpose of our webinar is to build and strengthen the Stanford Asian alumni community by learning from speakers from diverse industries, backgrounds, and experiences in an effort to promote mutual inspiration and support, especially during these uncertain times. Our session is scheduled to go 90 minutes, and we've allowed a good amount of time for Q&A. Before I introduce our moderator tonight, let me take a moment and acknowledge and thank Lisa Brown and Kathleen Lehman from the GSB Alumni Association for their continued support and guidance for these events. And thanks as well to my colleagues Mo Fong, Chris Lowe, Joyce Zhang, Soon Yu, Milan Sani, Dian Chen, and Vicky Shum for planning and running this event. Vicky will be our Q&A manager for tonight. Let me introduce our moderator. Soon Yu is from the GSB class of '93. In addition to a career as a general manager of consumer brands, he's also a best-selling author of Iconic Advantage, a book on how to build timeless brands. He's previously moderated for many of the on-campus talks we've had sponsored in the past, and we're pleased to have him back today. Without further ado, Soon, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And welcome to the entire audience. We actually are very excited because we had over 300 responses to this session, so that's an amazing number of responses. And we have incredible panelists that have amazing insights and stories and practical tips to share with you. Before I jump into it, I do also want to just take a moment to acknowledge Denise specifically for your leadership and for all your hard work in putting this together. I have never been on so many conference calls just to do this hour and a half. I think we were probably on about 10 of them to prepare for this. So thank you for organizing that and getting the collective thoughts and talents of all of the alumni together for this. So thank you. I also want to thank the audience for getting together. I know some of you it's early morning, some of you it's late night, some of you it's right in the middle of the day. Wherever it is and whatever time it is, I really appreciate your participation. As Denise mentioned, today is really about a few things. One, it's about our opportunity to learn from some amazing folks. So I ask you as audience members, really be open to that learning. We also are going to ask you to participate and really want to hear from you. And I'm encouraging you to support us through your curiosity and your questions. And lastly, as Denise mentioned, of the 3 goals, the most important one is that together, using seminars like this and online chats, that we strengthen the community, that we really sort of shorten the distance that we have in such a large and sort of challenging time through these type of seminars and through these type of discussions. Before I jump in and introduce panelists, I'd like to get a sense of who we have online. And so I'm going to ask Denise to launch our first poll. Our first poll is actually has 2 questions, and we're really curious where you guys are calling from, what part of the world. And there's also a second part to that, which is what class are you part of? This will give the panelists and myself a better sense of who we're speaking to so that we can sort of customize and just reflect our answers to best cater to who's online. So if you don't mind, please go ahead and fill that out. For those of you using a mobile device, you will notice that you're going to actually have a first screen that'll ask you the first question, and after you're finishing answering that, it will ask you to go to the next screen. So as you can see, we've got people calling in from all over the world, and it'll be very interesting to see the sort of the age breakout. Actually, I won't say the age, the class breakout of all the folks that we have online. So Denise, I think we have enough. You can go ahead and post the results. Wow, okay, so we have a pretty good representation, obviously, from the US, but a real strong representation from Asia. And scrolling down, it looks like we have a pretty even distribution of folks from all the various classes. And we have a few students joining us, so that's wonderful. Thank you so much, great. Well, today's topic is really the topic around how to take crisis and turn it into opportunity. And more importantly, what's the Asian perspective in doing that? And so we've brought together some amazing panelists who will both, who have amazing experiences in terms of dealing with crisis and turning it into opportunity, but also obviously come at it from a cultural perspective and also importantly, a geographical perspective. They're going to provide us helpful insights and also some practical tips that we can use in terms of taking crisis and turning that into opportunity. In terms of our panelists, it's pretty amazing what we were able to pull together. When I look at it, we have amazing rock stars that are alumni. We have one person who literally is a rocket scientist. We have another person who's an amazing advocate both for the public and private sector. And then we have a trailblazer in terms of starting new businesses and joining what I would consider sort of evangelistic causes and really entrepreneurial efforts. So in terms of our rocket scientists, we actually have Anne join us. And Anne, you've read her background, an amazing background. Anne is a senior executive at Genentech. And obviously, we're very excited to learn about what Genentech is doing and how they're dealing with the crisis from a science perspective. And what I loved about Anne's background is when I read that she's actually in the early development division. So obviously, COVID is probably one of the inspirations for what they're probably working on right now. And by the way, I consider her a rocket scientist mainly because she actually worked for NASA in the Jet Propulsion Lab. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. We also have Hsien-Hsien joining us from all the way from Singapore. And Hsien is really the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore and helping to bring American businesses and support them and set them up and have them be successful in Singapore. But she also has a background in public health. She's an adjunct professor teaching on public health, and she has a background in terms of helping health and public health companies communicate and market what they're doing to the larger sector. And lastly, we have a trailblazer in Sabrina Lin, who comes from us from HP. And actually, Sabrina, what's really interesting about Sabrina, she was telling me the other day, is that she, early on, about 12 years ago, actually developed training sessions for online seminars. So she's actually an expert at setting these up. And she did this a whole decade before we ever had Zoom. So that's what's amazing. And Sabrina's background is she was an entrepreneur. And from there, she really springboarded and is now in academics and has been pretty much the sales and marketing head of one of the most important universities in the world, which is the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our great panelists and basically say, where are you guys calling from? And really importantly, how has the current situation impacted both your personal and professional lives? And I'll start with Anne.
Thank you, Soon. I'm calling from the San Francisco Bay Area, not surprising, and waving to a few friends I know that are out there. Very happy to be here. Thank you. Your question is how are we doing, right, in the COVID crisis? So actually, I'll start on the professional side. So on the professional side, I'd say overall, well, it's not easy for most businesses, but at Genentech, and we are part of Roche, as you may know, I feel very fortunate that we're part of a company that's contributing in our own way to the COVID-19 crisis. So from the Genentech side, we have started phase 3 trials, and in particular for Actemra, which is an anti-IL-6 antibody that is used for autoimmune diseases. But what's known is that it also can control immune responses, cytokine storm release. And so it is one possible way of managing severe responses in COVID patients. And so we will hope that our trial will be able to show that. And there's a huge partnership with the FDA. On our Roche parent company side, Roche has provided COVID tests. It's a PCR-based test, and then also recently released a serology antibody test. The first test shows if you have the disease, and the second one shows if you've had it, which might be quite important if we care about immunity. So those are just quick highlights. On the personal front, my husband is an MD PhD clinical professor at UC San Francisco, and his lab runs COVID-19 testing for UCSF. So I'm hearing daily from the front lines what's happening on the university and hospital front. We have 2 teenage daughters, and they're mostly staying sane. And so we're very fortunate. I guess the last part I'd say is, probably on the difficult side, which I'm sure other people feel as well. My husband's mother was tested positive for coronavirus about a week and a half ago, and she had recently fell and is in a nursing home. So we are, wishing, she's living quite far away on the East Coast. So we're hoping the best for her as well. So some of it comes quite close to home too.
Thank you, Anne. And that was amazing that you've been dealing with it at a professional level, obviously with the family level, and also getting inputs from your family, but also on a very, very, very personal level in terms of a personal toll. So thank you for sharing that part of that. And, I think that's an important perspective as we think about the human side of all of this. I'd like to turn it over to Hsien to sort of share what she's been sort of dealing with in terms of the current crisis.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I am calling in from Singapore, as Soon said, and it is a very warm 70s, 80s type of day, as it is always here. So first off, I should share with you that there's been some conversation that warm weather may actually be better in terms of coronavirus transmission, in terms of reducing it. It is not likely to be true. It really is social behavior. So I wanted to, bust that myth right off the bat. As Soon said, I am in the School of Public Health here in Singapore. So I have a unique position of being able to connect both the public health side of the situation with what's happening for US companies here in Singapore as CEO of AmCham. One of the things that we've been talking about with the Singapore government has to be with perception. And another one of my duties here tonight is to share with you what it's been like here in Singapore specifically, and maybe a little bit in the region for Asia Pacific. Singapore, as you may have heard, has had an increase in the number of cases being detected every day. And I want to tell you why. And it is not because of massive community transmission between those who are perhaps asymptomatic, between family members or friends. It is really because of a very particular situation that we have on this island, which is around the way foreign workers are being housed. Now, you may know that this city-state depends a lot on foreign workers from around the region. There are about 20, 30, 40,000 of them at any one time out in the community working on our construction sites. So we're very grateful for their contribution to the economy here and to our community. They do tend to live together, so in large dormitories, partly due to preference and partly due to what we need in order to make sure that they're well taken care of. Unfortunately, that situation has meant that it has been easier for them to also become infected with COVID-19. That said, in the community, the transmission of COVID-19 is now well managed because we are in what we call a circuit breaker, which is essentially shelter in place. And so the community transmission now is in the single digits daily. So my message here to all of you today is that Singapore is doing well. We are managing the situation quite closely. It is hardly what you might think given the numbers that the situation here is not well in control. It is. And so that's the main message I want to share with you today, that Singapore is doing well. My family, I have a teenage son who's 17 and a daughter who's 11. Now in the second month of circuit breaker, they are starting to lose their minds. So as soon as I say, we are trying to stay healthy, but also trying to stay sane. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hsien. And I think it'll be important to hear from the Singapore perspective, because it's this idea of the second wave and actually how to deal with that successfully. I know Singapore was really successful early on, and now with the second wave, it sounds like there is a lot of learning from the first wave that you've been able to apply, and I think that's great. By the way, I'm hearing a theme. It's not just how to stay safe, but being together for 2 months, it's really how to stay sane, especially when you have kids. So that'll be some interesting learnings about that too. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sabrina and tell us where you're at and sort of what you're doing right now, and how you're kind of dealing with the current crisis.
Well, so I actually work in Hong Kong, but as Denise was saying earlier, when the music stopped, I was actually in Palo Alto, California, and I was told by my university to stay put for a while because everyone was doing shelter in place or very limited interactions, and I might as well do it remotely since we all moved to virtual collaboration. However, I do want to talk a little bit about the Hong Kong situation, since my workday is actually Hong Kong hours, right? So starting from around now, like Hsien, right, to about 2 or 3 in the morning. So that's been a lot of fun in a lot of different ways. So for us in Hong Kong, as I'm sure that many of you have heard or learned, right, that we've had some social unrest issues starting from June of 2019. So between the protests and then the pandemic, we've had to do a lot of adjustments in the university environment to provide online testing and a lot of monitoring and additional security, right? So initially for people coming into the university, and then now for health check type reasons. So it's been a long time, right? We talk about people going crazy after a month or two of lots of added measures. We've been this is almost a year of added measures from our university. Now on the positive side, this has really been a great opportunity for us to move from a very, I'd say, 20th century kind of work style to really more into a 21st century. What I mean by that is, I spent 30 years in the technology industry. I never knew how lucky I was in terms of the ability to flexibly work from home, anytime, anywhere. And all of that kind of culture. But when I stepped into the university, it felt like I went back, 30 years, where it was more about physically being and clocking in hours, and a lot of resistance of adopting tools for collaboration. So we've actually been able to, because of the burning platform that it's really created, have gone from about 0% adoption to conferences, video conferences, for example, to 100% adoption, because of course all our classes are now online. And we've actually had very surprising positive results. Of course, there are issues and kinks, but the positive results are there are equal number of kids, because we are a University of Science and Technology. So the vast majority of our students tend to be a little bit more introverted. They're really focused on, math and science, and they have a little bit more trouble speaking up. However, they feel that in a virtual environment, they're able to participate more because they can type in their opinions. right? And they felt that this actually helped them to be more engaged. So there's always a little bit of a silver lining to all of this. On the personal side, the good news and bad news is that all my children, I have 4 kids, you know, they're all adults now. The youngest one is already 22. But the positive news for me being stuck in the US is that I get to have same time zone. Unfortunately, I can't see them face to face as often because of all the shelter in place, but we can have much more same time zone interactions, which has actually been great. We've actually had more of them because we can do it virtually versus less of them.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. You know, just listening to our 3 panels, just in their introductions, I, like many of you, have watched way too much TV, and all of the TV seems to be so negative. But in listening to what all of you are saying, there seems to be so much, like you were saying, Sabrina, a lot of silver linings, a lot of new best practices that are being introduced and adopted quickly, because, you know, before change was hard, change is not as hard now in some ways. And then a lot of new developments on the science side. So with that in mind, let's talk about that topic of the silver lining, how to turn this idea of crisis into real opportunities. And so I think it's very important to Sabrina, I'd like to throw it back at you. You said added measures. What are these added measures, and how are people reacting to them? And I love the discussion about how introverts now actually feel like they actually have an ability to speak up in different ways. And so if you could talk a little bit about some of the things that you've done to take the crisis and turn it into opportunity, and the things you're doing more of, and some of the things you're doing less of, and what might we learn from that?
Yeah, so you know, so in terms of added measures, right? So we have more security checks. So you know, just a little backup a little bit on Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong has been really fortunate, right? It's a population of 7.5 million people, so about the same size as the Bay Area here, as well as maybe almost the same size as Manhattan in New York, right? And the total count of cases that Hong Kong has since January, with no closed borders with China, is 1,051 when I checked earlier today. And in fact, because there's, you know, aggressive contact tracing, a lot of it also has to do with the fact that Hong Kong went through a real crisis during the 2003 SARS. And so from a cultural perspective, everyone has been much more focused on personal hygiene. There was never, you know, people were already using masks whenever they were a little bit sick or not feeling well. There was no stigma attached to that. So and all the buildings, right? So a very easy way to transmit, right, is on elevators and buttons on the elevators. And so all of the, you know, antibacterial, you know, hand stuff, right, were still installed, right, since 17 years ago. And so all of those things were able to be reused, and culturally, there were already these practices in place. And with aggressive contact tracings, despite that, the you know, Hong Kong as a territory has, of course, have been embroiled in the turmoil of the protests, right? The hygiene items are things that people did adopt. You know, while there was a little bit of politicizing about, you know, using the excuse of social distancing to prevent people from being able to do protests. Of course, there's those kinds of things happen on the edges, but majority-wise, the fact that we only have 1,000 cases and only 4 deaths, right, in all of these months, is a really, you know, attribute to the fact that there's been 17 years of experience and practices that, and made that whole behaviors, as Hsien said, right, the social behaviors that have already been ingrained in place. At the university, it's really more about temperature checks coming in and out, and in Hong Kong overall, some of you may have read towards the end of April, the secondary school diploma, right, which is the diploma exams resumed face-to-face, right? They reset the classroom, the testing exam rooms so that they are spaced more apart, and then people entering in have to disinfect themselves, have temperature checks, and have to sign health declaration forms and so forth. But all those started at the end of April, and then school will resume beginning later on this month and through June, right? Except for the youngest nursery school students, those will resume. So we've been as a territory, we've been actually quite fortunate in that we had some of these policies and practices that's ingrained and adopted by the population for 17 years. And so therefore, restarting them much more diligently had not met with very much resistance.
That's really interesting. I think this gives us a lot of hope in the US, where I think social distancing is quite new, right? This idea of mask and hygiene and all these things. But I think through application, through practice, through the right type of communication, it seems like by adopting that, there is sort of a real, I think, curtailing of, the spread. And so and also this idea that as humans, we can learn new routines and develop new habits and best practices. And so I think that's very encouraging. Hsien, when we think about Singapore, I know you've had a similar experience to what happened in Hong Kong. Sort of when you think about this idea of taking crisis to opportunity, how has it been the same, but also very different probably in Singapore?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. First, I want to thank Wing Fong Lam. She left me a chat reminding me that it is over 30,000 foreign workers who have been tested, foreign workers in the construction sector, and in that sector, over 300,000 foreign workers here in Singapore. So thank you, Wing, for that correction. Now, moving on to the Singapore experience, I want to build upon what you mentioned earlier about safe and sane, because I am an epidemiologist by training, and while I think the Singapore government has done a fantastic job from day one in focusing on the facts, they also emphasize on understanding the medical aspects of the situation. What we haven't done so well at, I believe, and perhaps maybe it's being recognized around the world as well, is the emotional toll that this situation has taken on all of us in terms of the mental health as well. And I'm not kidding when I say that my kids are losing their minds, because I can see behaviors that normally be able to correct or shape more easily, but now they get somewhat fixated on certain things. And I see that as well in terms of the way people are reacting to what's happening. I mean, I think what Anne said around, Sabrina said around wearing masks and the right physical distancing, all of that. I think most of the population in Singapore, given the type of society that we live in, we are very socially conscious, we're rule abiding, we do follow all of that. But what we're seeing now is some behavior that I don't think we would have seen before. We have citizens in the wet markets here who are being asked not to sit down to buy their stuff and go back home, but instead they will stay and they will argue with the safe distancing ambassadors. I think it's a sign that the mental toll of the situation is something we need to look for and also help to manage. And this is going to have long-term effects even after COVID-19 is over, because we, as a society, Asians do not like to talk about mental health issues. It was only recognized a few weeks ago in Singapore that therapists and psychologists are actually essential services, and that patients who need to go see their psychologist or therapist need to be able to do so in person, because to some extent, for some of the vulnerable, the idea of holding up in your room where there are many people around and having that private conversation doesn't work. So now that's actually out in the open, and I think that's what we need to focus on more, rather than how many numbers of positives there are around the world. All that is important from a disease management point of view, but there's another disease that's brewing, which we're gonna suffer from for the long term.
That's a really important perspective, especially, we get into this idea of the Asian perspective on it, and the whole discussion on mental health and asking for help from an emotional point of view is a bit taboo with the Asian culture, and it's not something that is readily practiced nor readily accepted. And as you guys think about it from both the Genentech point of view, but also your own personal point of view, when you're thinking about treatments, obviously a lot of it has to do with the physical condition, but I'm pretty sure you guys also probably think about the whole package and think about the emotional side of it too.
Definitely. I wonder if it's a cultural changes and trends that might be happening. Certainly growing up Asian American, Chinese American in the US. I don't think, first of all, physical illness wasn't even talked about that much, certainly not mental wellness, mental health. So I think that's a trend that's opening up more. At Genentech, this actually happened prior to the pandemic. We have been really sharing very broadly how important mental health is. In fact, we've been doing philanthropic work through our Resilience Project, and also a lot of the project with young people and their health, is this idea that mental wellness early in life really matters, right? And that adverse events and trauma early in life can actually lead to long-term consequences, which results obviously in physical illness as well. So there's actually scientific work that we've been funding and granting. We also, over the last, I'd say, year and a half, have shared a lot of resources around mental health in general, a lot of testimonials by employees, colleagues, leaders about their own stories around mental wellness and health. And out of the many, I'm just giving you one example, but out of the many resources we have is that employees can have access to free therapists, right? Free paid services, right? So, and they will be fully reimbursed. And that actually can happen. I can imagine that that has been used quite a bit through this time period because it has been so difficult for a number of people. I would say, by the way, especially in terms of childcare, it's just very, very difficult to do work and also have children home at school, especially if they're small babies and toddlers. It's just very difficult. So I'm glad it's being more openly talked about, which is how are we doing personally?
Yeah, I'm very curious. Yes, mental health is sort of a taboo topic. Are there other things about being Asian that is both helpful, but sometimes potentially holding us back when we deal with this idea of crisis? And would love your perspective on that, Hsien.
There are many things about being Asian that I think are helpful. Some you might think is a bit funny, but at the end of the day, because Asians, at least in Singapore, okay, let's just say Singapore, where I've been living for 12 years, and I'm Taiwanese by birth, we're a little risk averse, and especially in Singapore, given that it's a very small community, 6 million citizens, the schools are very clearly organized and focused. There's a little bit of very structured thinking, let's say, that are taught to folks who grew up in Singapore, including my own children. And that, in that sense, has helped in situations like this. When you need the population to come together as a community, we have a saying here called SG United, right? And we talk a lot about emerging stronger together. And those types of sentiments, although you get grumblings and, we have commentary, and there's quite a lot of, stuff going on Facebook that you would think, wow, that's pretty outspoken for a Singaporean. On the whole, I think Asian community does think as a community, and we do come together. So I think that risk-averse behavior that I normally would say that Singaporeans go forward and approach different situations has in some ways helped us in this case.
Anne, do you have any perspective on the idea of sort of the Asian perspective in terms of dealing with crisis? Has it helped? Has it hurt?
Actually, I'll start with personally a little bit. I was thinking about your question. How does being Asian, or Asian American in my case, shape how I view crisis? And maybe like a lot of people in the audience, especially those who have parents who came to the U.S., my parents are Chinese immigrants, and my husband's half Japanese, half Eastern European. That's quite a mix.
Wow.
And so our entire family history, especially from the Asian side, is a story of crisis, right? It's a story of World War II and loss and displacement. That's actually how we ended up in the U.S. And so as I grew up on wartime stories. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. I'm probably still working through that. But because of that, I was actually thinking that might be one of many reasons why I'm personally in research and development in biotech, maybe for two reasons. And I think it is possibly because of a sense of history. One is to have a long view, right? It's a long arc end game. And for anyone who's trying to, make medicines or really think about new technologies, you really have to have persistence, and you really have to know what came before you, and also be able to imagine what the future could look like. So I think that that very likely shaped me. Second is this idea of giving back. Being part of something that's bigger than oneself is very appealing, very moving, and I do think that's part of the reason that I and maybe some others have actually chosen certain paths to take. I guess maybe more broadly, or maybe more professionally, in the U.S., even though I haven't had a chance, fortunately, to experience myself, I was reading that in late March, the FBI, federal law enforcement, had released several reports reporting, first of all, and then warning about increase in hate crimes, right, across the U.S. And the U.S. is quite a heterogeneous mix of communities, and I do think we all know that when people don't feel secure, they often look for and blame others. And so again, what I read actually was kind of fascinating, because I didn't know this part, is that in the case of contagious diseases, people also feel emotions of not only fear, but actually sort of repulsion or disgust. And that actually adds, kind of fuels this idea of other as well. And so, what we've done at Genentech, which is only, I'm sure, one of many things, one could do, is that I happened to host an event yesterday for my own group with Professor Jamil Zaki, who is a professor of psychology from Stanford. He's wonderful. He has research, he's written several books, and he specializes in this idea of empathy in a fractured world. And it was a topic that really resonated with our group. This idea of, human beings have the ability to cultivate a mindset, to create a skill, to increase our capacity for compassion. And maybe one quick last point is that he mentioned that there are two narratives that happen during crises. One is that people will panic and be very selfish. It's all for themselves. And we've certainly seen that, but that's one narrative. The other narrative is that people will help each other, that people will feel more connected, and that because of shared vulnerabilities, we will actually be stronger together. And that, I think, was an extremely appealing narrative. And we'd like to say that's a fact if we can. And I do think it is created if we can have more empathy for each other.
That's really powerful, what you shared about the idea of sort of there's two paths. And I'm very curious, Sabrina, in your experiences, how do we get to that second path, right? The one of a shared experience versus the one of sort of fear and flight, and what's your perspective on that, especially coming from an Asian perspective?
Yeah, sure. I'll share a little bit about myself first, and how I think change has changed my worldview. So in Hong Kong in the late 60s, so I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong in the late 60s was the Cultural Revolution that resulted in curfews, bombs, and so on and so forth. And my mother, because she was associated with the wrong side, she was a potential target. And as a consequence, I didn't know this because I was quite young, but we moved to Vancouver for a couple of years during that time. And when we first moved there, it was quite difficult. I got a sense, right? I was 6 years old, and I got a sense that bad stuff was happening. There was a lot of tension. And what I really need to do was to make life easy for everyone else. But I was put in a school way back then. There's no support for second language learners. I didn't speak English other than the ABC song, right? And it was really, really tough. But I think that because of those experiences and the fact that little kids learn languages really quickly, I recovered from that really quickly. It gives me, it shaped me to sort of think about controlling what I can and accepting what I can't, right? So if you sort of think about an Eastern perspective, sometimes we have the stereotype of being more fatalistic. And so talking about competing narratives, right? So fatalistic could be bad, quote unquote, right? Have negative connotation because you're just sort of giving in and not fighting it. But being fatalistic from the perspective of focus on what you can control is actually quite positive. And I think that, you know, from an Asian perspective, a lot of times what I really do try to do is to figure out how to do framing. So, you know, I was trained formally as a behavioral scientist, right? So framing an issue in such a way that appeals to the audience or the stakeholder that you're working with becomes quite important. So for example, you know, I've worked quite a bit in multiple different environments and have had stakeholders from very different cultural backgrounds. And what I've found is that with Asian bosses, so to speak, I spend a lot more time pre-socializing controversial issues with them, right? Crises with them, so that, because they don't like to be surprised in a big group, right? And have you announce something that they didn't know already and knew how to solve already, right? On the other hand, when I deal with, let's say, Americans, especially, for example, you know, I for a while ran a sales team. And one of the challenges with sales teams in a global company is who gets credit to retire quota against their, right, against their target, because that impacts your income. And so there's a lot of conflicts about, well, is this mine or is it yours? And a lot of times when you're dealing with multinational customers, then you have multinational colleagues that you have to negotiate with. And the way I approach the, you know, very aggressive, I have to say typically male counterparts, I tend to be much more confrontational with them because they respond better there. However, if I'm dealing with Asian, just as aggressive, but sometimes more passively aggressive counterparts, I try to find allies to make the argument for me versus really confronting them directly, because negotiating with them, especially as being a female, is, you know, doesn't work, right? So I end up being quite practical. And so I think those kinds of sort of dealing with multicultural type of situations, as well as framing the issue in the language and the perspective that matches, right, the other, you know, the person that you're communicating with. Those are the kinds of things that I really have learned over time. And then, you know, going back to my, you know, 6-year-old days, right, really focusing on what I can control and just accepting what I can't, has really helped me deal with really difficult situations.
Really helpful. You know, I was thinking back about what you said earlier about how the university is adapted and what's going on with Genentech and what's also going on with Singapore. And a couple of themes have really hit me. One is, you know, part of being Asian is this idea of, you mentioned it's fatalistic, but with sort of this resiliency attached to it. And I look at it as a certain degree of pragmatism, right? You don't want to keep hitting your head against a certain wall, and you just want to keep moving. And I think it was Anne that talked about this idea of the long view, right? And having resilience and seeing not only the past and having that historical perspective, but also knowing where you're going for. And I think, to me, that all leads to this idea that I think one of the benefits of having that sort of Asian perspective is the resiliency and the adaptability, right? And one of the things you're talking about is it's situational in terms of who you're dealing with. And it's some of it's cultural, some of it's just plain personality. This person's just different from that person. You've got to know that when you're dealing with them, right? But the adaptability, and I think those are really important lessons as we think about how to take crisis, right, and turn them really into opportunities. You know, I want to be cognizant. We got an amazing audience here, and they probably come from all these different backgrounds. And part of what we're dealing with right now is this idea of what's going to be the new normal. We're not sure exactly what that's going to look like, and what do we do in this new normal? And so I kind of want to turn it back to you, panelists, and say, look, what do you think this new normal is going to look like? Where do you think the opportunities are there? And you know, how are you viewing this new normal? And so, Anne, I'd love sort of your perspective on that.
Well, we're still in the middle of trying to get to that new normal, right? And some of the, actually one of the sentiments I heard, or phrases I heard, which I really liked, which is, instead of, for us at Genentech, to get back to normal, we want to get back to better. Because in the future, it may not be, it may not be our life before shelter in place, right? And why not? And why not learn from what's happened? There are terrible things happening, and there are real silver linings, right? There's also, what am I trying to say? We've all been thrown into an experiment. We've been debating working flexibly, working remotely forever. Well, you know what? Everyone's working flexibly and remotely now. So, that debate is mostly done. Now we're moving forward. So, for example, one of the things, especially in the R&D group, we like to talk about is, what would our world look like if we truly had talent without borders, right? And for scientists, that's not always easy, because, many of our scientists can be lab-based, but there's increasingly more data-driven, technology-driven science as well. So if you really think, okay, talent without borders, wow, in the back to better, in the post-COVID situation, maybe we can really make this happen, right? Maybe we don't have to only co-locate, or just as Sabrina was saying, situationally, when are times in which we can, collaborate and communicate remotely. But there are times in which I would say, especially in intense, early exploratory work, right, very innovation driven, sometimes you really do need to be physically together. But I like to think we can choose. I'd say that's one. The other one, just really quick, is I'm on the board of a startup called ECHO, EKO. And this is a company that has actually several FDA approved, just very recently, AI, artificial intelligence algorithms for cardiology. And this is with also very advanced stethoscopes as well. What the company has had is also a telemedicine platform, which was kind of like their side gig. But what's happened actually now during this COVID situation is that there's intense interest of marrying the two, which is, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if we could monitor heart and lung sounds safely and remotely, but also boost it with AI, right? So that you have, the confidence of the most expert cardiologists in the room with you while you are meeting with your patients. Some of the patients are actually COVID patients, but some of them are not. So I do feel that, the future of medical practice is also going to be something that will be in the new normal, right? Which is this much more comfort with telemedicine practice, and also how to do virtual or hybrid clinical trials. It's something that many of us are talking about right now as well. But also this idea of technology, really leading to much better outcomes for patients.
Just listening to the three of you and thinking about all the silver linings that I'm hearing a lot more silver linings than I'm hearing, what I hear on CNN every single day. And it's very exciting and interesting. And part of it is, if we were to imagine the world 5 or 10 years from now, and all the things that this current crisis has actually put into motion, and the optionality it has actually created, and the adoption of new ideas, new technologies, and the openness to change, I just, it might actually have accelerated us down certain paths that we were probably going to be kicking and screaming to get to. And so I think that's very exciting. Hsien, when you think about it from Singapore, I mean, you guys are at the forefront of the flow of Southeast Asia, the economic flow, the intellectual property flow, all of that. And how is this sort of, what is that new normal, and how can you imagine that to be actually a more positive place?
Yeah, so it's funny with these terms about new normal, old normal. I actually think there was never a normal per se. And in fact, I love it when things are not normal. And when I'm hiring, I always look for people who might look normal. As one of my Stanford advisors said, that person looks normal, but they're not. And it's actually a compliment, because I look for that quirkiness, that's something that's unique about that person. So I kind of hope that, in fact, I definitely hope that we're not edging toward any kind of normal, because to me, that means a sense of complacency. And if anything, the situation has taught us is you get complacent, things don't always work out in the best way. So we need to be sharp, we need to be creative. And again, people will say, oh, and I was caught up in this too, thinking we need to be more creative now that we can't do things the way we're used to. Well, actually, we've always been very creative. That's why we have startups like Echo AI. And I want to give a shout out to our friend, Dr. Carolyn Lam, who is from Singapore, a cardiologist here. And we've had loads and loads of creativity. The question is, have we channeled it appropriately? Have we supported it appropriately? And have we allowed it to scale to a point where people are actually aware that such creativity exists? And so the silver linings, in my opinion, have been many, one of which is startups and SMEs, small, medium size enterprises. You guys are business school people, so I don't have to, for me, it's subject matter experts when I say SME. But SMEs have done really well in many cases. And the Singapore government, for example, has been very focused on supporting SMEs and making sure as many of them as possible survive and thrive. And the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore is also launching a program so that there's more connectivity between multinationals and SMEs. I think that's a tremendous silver lining, that we're finally recognizing the power of startups and SMEs to drive our economies, and not just in Silicon Valley, not just in Cambridge, but everywhere around the world. The importance of women-led businesses, entrepreneur startups. And the other point I want to make is around global collaboration. There was a lot of conversation, you know, in the last few years around isolationism versus globalization. And what we've seen is global collaboration on a scale we haven't seen before. If anyone thinks that we can go back to an isolationist form of thinking, we can see that that isn't going to work for anyone or any one country.
You know, that's really uplifting to think about this idea that this current situation is actually accelerating the opportunity for, I think, organizations that are just more adaptive. And I think when you're a large, big organization, it's harder. When you're an SME, a small, medium enterprise, or a you know, startup, I think there's just more ability to pivot and be flexible and to, you know, adjust your business model. And I love this idea of without borders. I know you talked about talent without borders, but just this idea of without borders, right?
Right. Yeah.
This whole new norm is without borders. You know, it's community without borders. It's work without borders. And it's this idea of CEOs don't have to be a certain, you know, racial mix or a certain type profile in order to be a CEO anymore. And I think this idea of without borders is actually going to be accelerated given what's happening right now. And Sabrina, I know you guys are like, you're working for an institution that has always been, let's say, a more radical and sort of always sort of pushing the edge. And when you guys look at it from the academic side and where you're at from the Hong Kong perspective, you know, how does that new normal, or I guess we won't call it the new normal, what is better look like for us?
Yeah, so I want to build on Anne and Hsien's point about you know, about using of technology and having more global collaboration. So for me, the better, you know, even from a selfish perspective, is that the whole flexible work opportunities, right? It's been proven, as Anne says, that it works, and you know, there's not been a huge loss of productivity. Yesterday, I was just reading an article where they, you know, interviewed 200 different people on what the new normal looked like, and I remember reading something from a leader from Goldman Sachs in Japan saying that that she hopes that with the fact that it's been proven that you can work not by clocking hours physically in an office, and that in Japan, of course, people work very long hours, and that if that's possible, that means women, the gender gap is going to be reduced, and potentially also men who are now spending way more time at home maybe can do more of their share of housework. And what the prediction is that Japan's GDP can grow an extra 10 to 15%, right? So that's a very positive view of what can be possible, and I think that is also something that would be possible to support our university employees, our staff, our faculty, and our students. For me personally, as I mentioned way earlier, my family is here, I'm there, right? So I'm very happy if this whole virtual collaboration is here to stay and there's no stigma tied to it, because then I can spend more time working there borderlessly, right, from here in the US. So The second point I want to make is really around the collaboration across discipline. Our university tends to, because it's smaller than other institutions, we have really focused on multidisciplinary collaboration. So while we don't have a medical school, right, we have our double E professors working on signal processing, collaborating with our more life sciences researchers, and they have actually used data modeling to accelerate the development of understanding of the COVID virus based on SARS, the SARS virus information, right? Similarly, you know, our chemical and biological engineering professors have actually adopted some of the new antibacterial materials or sprays that they put together that actually are now smart, meaning that they're activated when it senses heat, which means that if you have a hand that touches a doorknob, then it can release the, you know, antibacterial capabilities. So therefore they can have, so it's been, you know, they invented a spray that would last up to 90 days in a commercial setting. And what we have done is collaborated with an industry partner to do manufacturing, and they're using this this product to all the nursing homes and major buildings as part of a you know, giving back opportunity. So I think the innovation is really expanded, not only across borders, but also across disciplines as well.
It's great to hear that from the academic perspective. And I think you're right. Having been involved in a lot of innovation, I think one of the key accelerants and the key ingredients is this idea of multiple points of view and a lot of collaboration with those different SMEs, subject matter experts, right? I want to be cognizant of time. I want to make sure we have some time for the Q&A. But before we get there, you know, we have a lot of folks. We have some students, but we also have a lot of alumni. And right now, they're kind of looking at the future. And let's face it, some of our current careers are probably a little bit in question in terms of the stability, in terms of where it's going to go. What advice would you give our alumni and our future alumni as they think about sort of navigating the next few years of their career? And with that, I'd love to turn it over, Anne, and some perspective on that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm trying, few thoughts I have in mind, not knowing exactly, of course, you know, people have so many different interests. So maybe a few thoughts and principles, right? Definitely well, first of all, find something that you're very interested in today, because it's very hard sometimes to figure out what you want to do in the future. And I've definitely seen people sort of fall into the trap of, oh, if I do these 5 things, I'll get here. And they actually end up not being very happy. But if you lead with your own curiosity, I always feel like that's a great compass, first of all. I'd say second of all, you know, especially during these COVID times, while it might sound simple to say, I would look for work and also groups of people who really have strong values. I mean, I think this is where, you know, you could say the water's receded and you really see the companies and the teams and the institutions with very strong values have really prepared for the current situation in the future, and they are holding strong. And then there's ones which I'm just thinking, to be honest, are faltering or not really walking their talk, as it were. And those institutions I don't think will last. Actually, it's in some ways it's terrible to say, but it's a bit of shaking out. And I do think that you know, be part of a group that really, you know, I personally think, this is my own bias, you know, go back to the long view, that has a long view, right? And has persistence. Maybe one last thing is that I've had a chance to be a fellow of the Aspen Institute, and I have a mini reunion this Sunday with my fellows cohort. And one of the things that the Institute has asked us to do is to think about what's a good society. So maybe my last advice is, you know, if you're looking for new paths, new lines of work, or exploring just new options, you know, think about not only will this give you professional satisfaction, but will it contribute to what is a good society.
Wow, that's really helpful advice. I think two perspectives on that. Now, we're actually now afforded the opportunity to actually ask that question. I think sometimes when everything's going so well, you're just trying to chase the next big thing that's in front of you, versus now is actually a time to reflect. And what's really important isn't just the time to reflect, it's the time to actually ask the question you just asked, which sometimes we just don't even think about asking that question. So we're afforded that opportunity, and in some ways that's a nice privilege and luxury that we're actually being given. Denise, I apologize. I know I skipped one of the polls. I'd love to actually field the third poll, which is sort of related to this topic. And Denise, if you don't mind coming back on, I just wanted to know, could we field poll 3, which is, how are folks feeling about COVID-19 in terms of how it might impact their careers positively? Is it neutral? Is it negatively? And I'd also be curious if we ask this question before the panel, but let's ask it right now. And so for those of you, again, on the mobile, it should come up fairly quickly and take up the full screen. And we should see the results pretty soon. But Anne, I really like that advice about thinking what type of society, and also thinking about the idea that we're responsible. We have to take part in creating that. We can't just sort of assume that it's going to happen without some degree of intent and involvement, right? Yeah. Hsien, I'm sort of advice to our alumni in terms of as they think about their career.
Yeah, I'm usually not one to give advice because my career has been all over the place. But actually now I think having a career that's been all over the place is a good model for how people might think about.
Wait, how many countries have you lived in? I think it's been like at least a dozen.
Not that many. Oh, only about 5 or 6, I think. Okay. And it was in some ways not planned because I'll tell you a little bit about my career history and see what you can take away with it, take away from it. But I did graduate from Johns Hopkins, and right after it, I joined my husband in Taiwan. We'd gotten married straight out of college, Stanford. And so I was 21 when we got married, finished my PhD when I was 25, and went straight to Taiwan because guess what? That's where he got posted. So it wasn't necessarily something that I could choose or plan. I just went with the flow. So I love the word flow because that's just generally who I am. I go with the flow. So for 10 years, we went all over the place in Asia. My one child was born in Japan. The other one was born in the UK. And during that time, I pretty much knew that even though I was an epidemiologist, I technically should be able to run studies. I wouldn't be able to do so because of language barriers in the various countries where I lived. So, some of the things that I always tell people when I say, I actually didn't plan for much, but what I did was take advantage of any opportunity that came my way that I thought was interesting to play around with, right? So in terms of what factors that you need to look for as you're moving ahead in your career, I would say it's persistence, luck, and opportunity, all 3 of those, because I moved into a career in healthcare communications and corporate communications simply because during the years that I moved around, that was the most portable career that kind of suited my personality. I wanted to improve my writing chops. I wanted to develop a voice. So that kind of commentary fit well, right? So persistence, luck, and opportunity, I think are absolutely critical as you look around and see what you should do. The other thing is that don't get too fixated on what you think you ought to do or what other people think you might want to do. Don't be afraid of failing. I mean, Soon and I were talking about this before this panel, is that the idea of failure, we always talk about, and you see a lot of articles about this, right? We should embrace failure, but failure never feels good. So in my perspective, I think maybe don't think of it as failure, just think of it as an experiment. So in one of my most recent jobs, I had a chat with my boss, and I didn't like the role that I was in. It was a really great role, but yet it got to the point where it didn't fit with my ambition and with my family life. So I just said, and he felt really bad about it, which was really quite funny because I was like, okay, we've kind of gotten to a decision point, and he started getting really anxious. I said, I think it's okay. It's just an experiment, right, on both sides. And as it turns out, many experiments don't work out, and it's okay. So I see that there's a question from a young alum saying, well, what do we do? Well, even from you graduate, you have a set, you have a set of skills and you think you really want to use them, but sometimes only one tool fits, right? Or only 2 tools fit out of that toolbox. Be flexible, use them today. In about a year, you get to use some other tools. And also, secret of life, I think, is managing your expectations. So go into it, try your best, but also manage your expectations.
Those are such helpful pieces of advice.
I'm trying to write down this for my next career.
I was going to say, you wrote a book on it. It's just so good.
Like, oh, that's a great.
One thought came to mind is this idea of experimentation is that if we can view ourselves as work in progress, like prototypes, right? Like we're just continually prototyping who we are, who we're going to become, where we're going to go. And we think about these sort of curveballs as opportunities. Literally the transitions are what presents opportunities, and the challenges is what requires the persistence, right? And so I just think that perspective is really, really helpful. So with this discussion, I'm very curious what the audience is feeling right now in terms of their career. And so Denise, if you wouldn't mind just sort of sharing what the results were. Sort of even. I would say it's sort of a neutral right now. And so I think part of our goal long-term is how do we turn it into a situation where there's more opportunities being shared and presented. And talks like this are great, but the fact that we are collaborating and sharing, I think, is incredibly important. Before I go to you, Vicky, real quick, just really any sort of final piece of advice, Sabrina, for our alums, and then we'll turn it over to Vicky for the Q&A.
Yeah, so I'll be short because, I mean, Anne and Hsien have shared a lot of things, and I really resonated to what Anne talked about in terms of taking the long view, right, and really pursue something that you are actually interested in. This is what I tell students that come to me, right? Imagine that you're spending the majority of your waking hours in a job, right? Do you really want to spend the majority of those waking hours doing something you don't like to do, or working with people you don't like to be, dealing with, right? So ask yourself that question. And then the whole experimental kind of point of view that Hsien mentioned, which is that, I actually had fairly similar kinds of experiences, although I think I'm quite a bit older than you. But I also went down get a Silicon Valley job path, mostly because my husband had a job that he wouldn't want to leave, and my academic teaching opportunities were not in the Bay Area, right? So I sort of, quote unquote, made a compromise, but it worked out really well for me. In the year 2000, my startup blew up like everyone else, and so that was a major crisis. I went from a, early startup valuation in the high single-digit millions to zero overnight, and I felt like, very big hit personally, like I was a real failure. But it turned out that, I had the opportunity to spend more time with my 4 kids, which at that time was, they were being taken care of by 2 nannies turning 4 by 7. And I just sort of questioned, like, why do I even have those kids if I'm not spending time with them? But at the same time, it also brought an opportunity for me to take a job where I could, I ended up working in emerging countries. And then I'm sure that because of that experiences, I ended up in Asia over the last 13 years, and being able to apply that. So things happen, right? The opportunity is an intersection of luck and some kind of preparedness. But one item that I do want to add is what Soon you mentioned earlier. I think you or Denise mentioned earlier, right? Is that participating in events like this, you try to strengthen the community. And I would advise that, all of our alumni or our students to make sure you build such a community, that you stay connected to such to a community, right? That you network in, whatever your professional associations are, or you connect with your classmates or your other alumni contacts. But, the whole preparedness is that if you stay connected, right, whether you learn something and you keep in touch with the areas that you're interested in and people that you're interested in, that's how you find out about the opportunities in the first place, right? And you don't know something exists, you can't take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you, Sabrina. I think just in this conversation and listening to you guys, I feel so much more hopeful. So many more sparks and synapses have been actually going on in my brain in the last hour. And also a feeling of being part of a community is really, I think has developed also in the last hour. So with that, let's bring in the community. And I'm going to turn it over to Vicky. And the community has some great questions for the panelists. So Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Hsien, and all the panelists for such a great and insightful talk so far. I'm happy to be part of this and curating questions from the audience submitted both before as well as live as we speak. We do have a great set of questions, and they span pretty high-level COVID-related questions to a little bit more intimate, what are your leadership styles and traits questions, to kind of forward-looking opportunities. So yeah, let's jump right in. So speaking of community, it's about being part of the Asian community. It's from Peter. With the rise of China and Asia and the visibility of Chinese, Asians around the world, it has brought progress and prosperity to many. But it seems that the world has expressed more animosity and blame towards China, partly flanked by selective rhetoric. I believe we're coming to a period of tremendous challenge as Asians and Asian Americans. What can we do as a community to counter this?
Anybody like to take this on?
I'd like to address this one because I am outside of the US and I haven't lived in the US since '98. So my Asian American identity has shifted over the years. So I'm still trying to discover the Asian American side of me, so to speak, because I've been gone for so long. In Singapore, obviously, we're in a different situation because we're already in Asia. So that sentiment you might think doesn't exist, but it does. So I'm going to be very frank. In Singapore, it is a Chinese-dominated society, right? And despite that, within the Chinese population, there are those who are directly from China, and even if they are citizens, they are well known as not being local enough, right? And then you have me, I'm also not local enough, but I'm not from China, I'm from Taiwan. Now, let's not get into argument about whether Taiwan is part of China, but you can see how you can start to segment all of this and just keep dividing it further. But what I think is that it's all based on emotion. And it's also very human for us to try to define our tribe and to think of the other folks as others. And so while I appreciate what Tammy has said in the Q&A around facts, because I also think we need to get the facts straight, for goodness sakes, right? And we know we have an issue with that in certain quarters of just simply getting the facts straight. But at the end of the day, we go back to the fact that it's all incredibly emotional. So you really can't counter emotions with facts, in my opinion. So I think countering it with understanding and just kind of agreeing to disagree and just letting people be who they are, but also showing them that you care about them and using the right language is going to go a long way, because I hear about the things that are happening in the US, and I'm very proud of the Asian American community for standing up, but I also don't think it would be right for us to fight fist to fist. I think we can only combat this with good understanding and good communications.
Thank you, very helpful. And Sabrina, you might have perspective being in Hong Kong. Obviously, there's some tension there with the idea of both being part of China, but also feeling separate from China.
Yeah, so, so in Hong Kong, right, so it's not so much, ethnic issues, right? We are 98%, ethnic Chinese. And there is an issue, right? Because I actually think that some of the concerns are very similar to nationalistic movements around the world. It's about feeling like you're competing for opportunities with others, right? And as Hsien said, are you Chinese enough or are you not Chinese enough? And what I'm actually a little bit heartened to see, I think, when you're outside of Hong Kong and you see coverage, the coverage tends to really look at a little bit of the extremes two ends versus, most people are more in the middle. I mean, of course, as somebody who was born and raised in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has been my home, it's very, disturbing and distressing to see the society being torn apart. But I was heartened to see a recent, in fact, yesterday we get, clippings and so forth from the university that one of our student leaders and the student leaders across Hong Kong tend to be very much sort of pro-independence and so forth. But it was first time I saw some measured comments, right? So yes, we do support the concept of Hong Kong independence, but I personally wouldn't advocate for it, right? So some recognition for, a pragmatic approach. At the same time, he also mentioned that, well, we also have students from mainland China who really focus on one country, one system versus one country, two systems. And we really try to encourage students to allow them to express that opinion because we want to have freedom of speech, and freedom of speech cuts both ways. So we don't see that so much in media coverage, right? Seeing that, because people are really forced to take, the polarization gets extreme. But I think, in my personal interaction with students, they are torn. They feel that they don't want a society that's split between two. And I hope that we heal. I mean, of course, protests have restarted again now that the pandemic has died down and there's not been very many infections, but I hope that we don't have the kind of extreme violence that we were seeing.
Thank you, Sabrina. I think it is interesting to be multifaceted, right? To all of us coming from different places, different cultures, different backgrounds, but the one thing is interesting. We have a shared experience right now, which is global, right? It's a global shared experience. So that is actually something that we can build on in terms of trying to connect and trying to deal with some of the stuff that is not as positive. Vicky, let's see if we can get to 2 or 3 more questions. You said there's probably some related to COVID, and I bet Anne is just anxious to probably answer one of those.
Yeah, so definitely given our panel of experts in kind of life sciences as well. So a popular question, actually sort of a multi-part question. What factors will cause a second wave of COVID-19 infections? Which countries will likely see the second wave? And in that scenario, in this future potential pandemics, what might be the initial response by municipalities? Would something different emerge as responses?
And I know some of it's a little not in the expertise, but I think you're probably very well equipped to answer a lot of it. So,
well, I'm pretty good at speculating, like everyone else. So, because I actually don't know. So, one fact, which you already know, is that, scientists, certainly some at our company, we're not an infection, we have some infectious disease expertise, but we're not known. Yeah, sorry, that's not our main sort of core. But also, from what you read as well, is that scientists are still trying to figure out this disease, right? I mean, even though coronaviruses, I do think that there's a good chance that there could be a vaccine because there's so many different technology approaches, whether DNA-based, RNA-based, going for the spike protein, there's multiple good shots that are going on, but this is a new disease. So, in some ways people don't know. I would say the local speculation is that there will be waves. I mean, that's just what we've seen with this type of, SARS, and I think MERS, are good, indicators of what will happen. I worry a bit, especially maybe in the US, that there's just so many differeces of opinion about how to handle the physical distancing, social distancing. You're seeing parts of and I know we don't want to stray too much into politics, but there are beliefs, there are facts, and there's just unknowns, right? And so the mix of that seems quite heterogeneous, actually, I would say, even across different regions of the US. So I'm not sure which regions will happen, but I do hope that people will be vigilant and be, frankly, somewhat conservative. On our side, I know Genentech Roche, we're trying to figure out, we're an essential business, so we do have folks on campus, working on campus to keep our clinical trials moving forward. We're primarily a company that focuses on very serious and life-threatening diseases. About half of our portfolio is for cancer patients. And so we've made a lot of promises to our patients to keep them on treatment experimental treatment, but through this. So there's a lot of people on campus, but we're also now figuring out how we can, in stages, move people back, right? And I would say one of the assumptions we have is that multiple waves could happen. So we're trying to protect against how can we mitigate against that.
I think we will expect multiple waves, but it's nice to see big corporations like the ones you're working at being more of an activist in the solution, which is an incredible sort of statement. So I think that's very. Vicki, another question for the panel?
Yeah, so
sorry, can I just add a little bit to that one? Because from an epidemiology perspective, Larry, your question is incredibly complicated because as we all know, testing hasn't been consistent across the countries. And so the numbers you're seeing aren't reflective of really what's happening on the ground. So when you say which countries are likely to see the second wave, it's possible that everybody's already in the second wave or the third wave. We just didn't know enough to begin with, right? And then on top of which, you've got population densities, you've got behavior patterns. So your question actually is so incredibly complicated that it's very difficult to answer. And I want to point that out because I think we have a tendency to go too simplistic in our thinking about COVID or most any other crises, if you think about it. I think people need to embrace the complexity of decision making, understand that situations are so complex, you're just doing the best you can given what you have. So please, I would urge folks it wouldn't be this crowd, I'm sure, but any kind of blame or shame or any of that is operating on just as little information as we're claiming that others are doing when it comes to making COVID-19 decisions.
That's really helpful for going from the fear to the really collaboration side. Thanks. That's great. Vicki?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so switching gear to leadership style. So this is actually from April and a couple others previously submitted questions. So while the key theme for today is obviously the uniquely Asian perspective on leadership during the current crisis, it's definitely not often that we have such a full panel of accomplished female leaders sitting all together from different parts of the world, in addition to Soon, of course. So the audience is curious about the female leadership perspective, about how being a woman has helped or hampered you in leading your teams, your organization, or your own cohorts, especially during a crisis. And they want to hear about how to embrace more female traits or feminine traits, empathy, emotion, or sense of humor, for example. Yeah, any comments on that would be appreciated.
Open it up. Anyone want to take this?
Well, I mean, I can say a few words on this. I think, and this is probably more, my experience than I'm not sure if I am qualified to talk about what we should do, but I think it's been always important to me to feel comfortable in what I do, right? It's hard while I do look at others that are doing certain things much better than I can do, and I would say, okay, what would so-and-so do, and can I learn from what they do so I can improve myself? I think in general, it's really important to, I think that authenticity is really important. So it's very hard to be someone else, or maybe I find it very hard to be someone else. And so I think that aspect is not so much feminine or masculine, right? It's just, who you are. In terms of styles, I do, going back to some earlier examples, I think adaptability to the situation is really important, right? Adaptability to the situation, whether it's, the kind of people that you're dealing with at that moment in time, or that, how you frame the issue based on, what the audience wants to hear. I think that therefore having a more emotional understanding of the situation is helpful. Now, to the extent that that's quote unquote feminine, right? That's good. But I think that men that I know that are very, very good at developing relationships and coaching and mentoring also have that EQ as well. So I think sort of being in tune, taking the perspective of the other party, even if you disagree with them, is really an important thing to trait to have. So let me stop there so others can, Anne and Hsien can chime in.
Great. Well, we'll take one more response to this because I want to be cognizant of the time, and then there's sort of one final question I want to pose to the entire panel. So either Anne or Hsien, please jump in here, and then we'll pivot quickly in the next minute to the lightning round, I guess.
You know, maybe a few thoughts, because the topic of, you know, women in leadership and business and science is a pretty big topic. So I often, I'm often asked, you know, are there intrinsic differences between men and women? Maybe, maybe not. I'm always trying to make sure that it's evidence-based. You know, what I've found is some of the dynamics that I've seen and also, you know, read about is it often is about power. It's about who the majority is, who are the decision makers at the table, and in many cases, sometimes women might be in the minority, and in that case, there are dynamics. So I do think that for any of us, and actually that's actually one of my favorite classes at GSB was Power and Politics. Do you remember that class? Did everyone take it? Like, that class was amazing, and because I do think of a comment and actually advice that one of our executive coaches once gave to one of our leadership teams that I was on. And to paraphrase, he said, you know, before your scientists were scientists, they were human beings, okay? Which really means that, you know, if you really understand, you know, what matters to people, what matters to human beings, if we can find both commonalities, but also leverage our differences, then we really could, you know, create something bigger together. And I do feel that human beings are actually exquisitely wired to detect, you know, who's in power, who's making decisions. And I think that if you know, if I were giving advice to a female leader, you know, be aware of that. I don't mean power like in an evil, you know, Machiavellian way. I just did that, right? But rather, you know, just simply, how do organizations work, right? How do things get made? Who has influence and who doesn't? And you know, if you're somewhat attuned to that and develop skills around that, you know, I think there's more opportunity than barriers.
Yeah, I think this idea of managing the idea of power, you know, as a content piece. Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. I think given the time, I want to be respectful to the audience. We still have over 100 people on it, so it's amazing that obviously the panel's been great and the advice has been good. But I want to ask one final question to all the panelists, and if we can just give us sort of just one simple answer to this. But what are you most hopeful for coming out of this crisis? And so, Hsien, why don't you share one thing that you're most hopeful for?
Sure. I'm most hopeful that people finally will recognize that public health is the science of humanity. As Richard Horton, who's the editor-in-chief of Lancet, has been known to say, that's been my motto for many years. People didn't realize that public health was so important. It's traditionally been underfunded, but now I think most everyone knows what an epidemiologist is. So hopefully I won't have to field that question again. But public health, please keep it in your consciousness. Please pay attention to it, because it isn't just about COVID-19. It's about infectious disease. It's about cardiovascular disease. It's about cancer. Public health is very, very important. And I'm very hopeful that we finally recognize that.
Thank you. And adding on top of that, we talked about earlier, mental health as part of public health is really important. Great. Anne?
I would just say two quick things is that, you know, science really matters. And I hope that our ability to really understand, you know, the role that science plays really increases at least in the US and beyond. There's a little bit of an anti-science sentiment that's been happening. And I really hope that this can show kind of model. The other one is strong communities matter. I mean, both local and then also, you know, what our common identity is, you know, at least again in the US. And that's what I wish for, is that, you know, we're based on a lot of efficiency, entrepreneurial aspects and innovation, and I love it. I mean, that's actually what I signed up for. But a strong society cannot just be about the technology and efficiency and productivity. It has to be about community.
Great. And Sabrina, something that you're most hopeful for?
Well, so I want to just touch upon, to complement the other comments, right? So I want to touch upon sort of personal resiliency. overall. And I just want to bring a quote that is always it's been my favorite, and I think about it when I'm in a crisis, which is a quote from Amy Tan from one of her books, which says, when you can't change your fate, change your attitude. That's it.
Thank you so much. First, I just want to apologize to the audience. I know there were a lot of questions in the queue. Vicki, we probably could have had this session for another hour and a half to just try to answer some of the questions. And maybe we'll have to have another session just to do the questions. I want to thank my panelists. I personally learned so much. I was a bit nervous doing this because first I actually did a fireside chat online. And so starting off, I was, you can't see the audience and then this technology, but boy, just listening to your inside stories and the humanity you guys are bringing to everything you're doing and the intentionality, it's very inspirational, and I feel very connected to this community, so much more so than when I began. And that sense of being connected to you guys and what you're doing and what you care about helped me overcome my nervousness and really find this conversation. I just learned so much, and thank you for sharing so many of the silver linings. And if we can walk away, all of us, with the idea that public health matters, science matters, communities matter, and staying resilient and adaptable throughout this whole thing, we're going to kick some butt coming out of this as a community. So with that, thank you, and everyone have a good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good middle of the night, and wishing you all the best through this tough time. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.